Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Eeva Mäkinen. Today's event is called Planetary Political Imagination and Democracy from Ideas to Action. So I'd like to warmly welcome you all. The goal of today's event is to bring visibility to novel ideas of global democracy, sovereignty, and political imagination. Today we'll be having 3 presentations, myself, Max Dahlberg, and Heikki Patomäki. So POLIFA, which is my organization that I founded a couple of years ago, its goal is to bring forth these more novel ideas on freedom, democracy, and political imagination. So my name is Eeva Mäkinen. I'm a PhD researcher in political studies at the University of Lapland. At POLIFA, we organize events, share articles, and produce collaborative events. So if you'd like to collaborate on something, please reach out. So today we'll be hearing from Max Dahlberg. Max Dahlberg is the founder and chairperson of the Global Visions Association. The aim of the association is to bring together people, groups, and ideas that are striving to build a better world, with the view focused especially on global possibilities regarding all of this. You can find more information about us on our web. And then our third speaker is Heikki Patomäki. Heikki Patomäki is a professor of world politics and global political economy at the University of Helsinki. He has worked as a full professor also in Nottingham and Melbourne, and as a visiting professor in Kyoto and Aberystwyth. He has published some 20 monographs, 10 edited volumes and special issues, and more than 250 academic papers on topics such as the philosophy of social sciences, global political economy and security, economic and political theory, as well as peace research. So I'll be presenting my own ongoing research that I'm doing at the University of Lapland. The headline is Universal Politics of Imagination, Cage of Reality in a Kingdom of Freedom. The background to my research is found within global problematics of erosion of politics and democracy, homogenization of knowledge and thought, and the so-called depoliticization of imagination, identity, and post-truth politics. My background is in development studies and development geography as well. So now my interest in my research comes from a postcolonial perspective here. And typically in postcolonial studies, there's a very common critique of this Western paradigm of this universalist episteme of reason as truth, sense, enlightenment, and modernization. But less attention has been given to imagination, even though it has been considered a creative faculty ever since ancient Greece in Western political studies. So briefly about my research framework. If we say that there's a problem with this global erosion of democracy or political imagination, my interest is more about that if we think about that there's a lack of imagination, it's not really correct. It's more about our inability to actualize imagination. So it's not that we cannot imagine anymore, but it's more about how we even perceive how knowledge is produced or political change is produced. So my context is I am building a theory of political imagination, which looks at universalism and or tries to build like a different definition of universalism that has often been criticized towards a more affirmative ontological freedom and imagination. So the objective is to shed light on democratic, joint, and plural practices and what role imagination has in the process. So my interest is, in my first question, is that it's not really the lack of imagination, but what makes it political. How can we politicize imagination beyond this kind of vacuum of negation towards affirmative freedom, meaning that we have already the ability to have these ideas and to how to just bring them forth. And my second research question is in relation to the political ontology behind it. So how could we think of political ontologies and practices beyond identity, such as the nation state. So my theoretical framework is in continental and postcolonial political philosophy. So I use Deleuze, and then postcolonial thinkers such as Membe, Felwine, Diani, and Fanon. So today I will just give a brief introduction of the main framework, and in the end I will give a brief example from Kenya, where I have been working a lot recently. So like I said, imagination has long been considered as a creative faculty of the subject, but it has been subordinated to reason ever since the Enlightenment in Western thought. So imagination, there are roughly 3 ways we can approach it. It can be seen as an individual capacity, or societies themselves being imaginary, or the very foundation of politics and societies being imaginal, without being tied to assumptions of specific realities. So often we think of political imagination as being tied to these specific ideologies or outcomes we need to kind of achieve. And if we're unable to do so, it can lead to this apathy and kind of assumption that we wouldn't have these ideas. However, like I said, the problem lies more within the barriers that inhibit the actualization of imagination. So my context here is both that I use from Deleuze is seen as a virtual universal ontological condition. So this is the planetary aspect that kind of combines, this is kind of where imagination lives in a sense. And then my second aspect is that it's considered like a plural political activity. So Deleuze is was a French post-structuralist thinker, and he uses this virtual and actual in one of his concepts. So I mentioned Fanon, and here I would like to describe a bit what he meant by universal humanism. So this is a core part of many postcolonial thinkers, and Fanon is one of them. So Fanon advocated for objective and subjective freedom. And to him, it was leveraged through collaborative solidarity and revolutionary humanism of that specific generation. And Fanon describes this purpose as a generational mission to be fulfilled or betrayed. So it has this kind of messianic temporality as part of it, but his main idea was to kind of understand that we have to come together and find those causes that combine us all, that go beyond these dividing identities. So it's kind of becoming other through imagination. This is the main idea that I also pursue within here. So my main, or one of the components in my theoretical framework is that imagination can detach us from our identities temporarily for us to unite for a shared political cause to create new identities. So here what I mean by identities is that they can be whatever institutions, norms, categories, political ideologies, but the point is to create new ones, so we shouldn't be stagnated in the old ones if they're not working, basically. So through a primacy of imagination as difference and beyond experience produces a paradigm of performative nature of thought, existence, and creation from the outside of the self. So this in turn provides us with insights to processes of democratic, plural, and joint political practices beyond dividing or stagnated identity, representational politics. So here, like I said, identities do not only refer to ethnic, gender, racial identities, but rather to all our established institutions, such as nation states, governance, ideologies, or norms. So by becoming other in joint action, this is an idea that Deleuze really pursues. How can we become other to unite without losing our differences? So here is an example from Kenya from last year when I was there. There's been some revolutionary movements and protests, and Kenya's politics has long been marked by this tribalist ideas, which has strong colonial roots. But in summer 2024, these nationwide protests really erupted, largely led by the youth, and they called themselves as tribeless, fearless, and leaderless. And their focus was on, indeed, on these shared causes and visions rather than identities. So as this Senegalese philosopher, Diani, has stated, African thought has passed from yesterday's thinking of identity, which was part of the struggle against colonialism, to today's thinking of becomings. So this becomings is also a large part of what Deleuze and Membe, for example, talk about. So this means this kind of affirmative political thought rather than this kind of negation that you need to kind of win over your freedom from the oppressor, but rather that you already have the freedom to do different things, just temporarily kind of detach and be united, and then you can create, at least temporarily, these transformative politics, which are led by these causes rather than identities, which can create these kind of erosive effects. So here, this is just a general outlook of my research, but here it's the ontological universal condition as the productive political local action. So this basically just means that the universal idea, because often, as in postcolonial studies, it's been understood that as if there's like a vacuum of power from the West, as this, that the reason just dominates everything. But in my theoretical framework, imagination and freedom comes first. It has primacy, which means that it actually changes the way we think about how we can pursue things. And then this takes different forms locally through this, it actualizes itself in different forms locally. So here I largely talk about the difference between universal and pluriversal. These are often been kind of these binaries, or universal and or particular. So this really gives us, like, it's more like a logic that I'm studying. So it's, what interests me is that how this can take different forms also on a planetary level, in planetary governance, but taking different forms locally, such as in the case of Kenya. So we'll be hearing more from Heikki Patomäki on this freedom of or sovereignty beyond nation states later. So I'm not really focusing on governance here, but this is a core part of, like, now because I'm studying things that's from an African perspective especially, kind of like becoming other. So then from that perspective, there are several movements at the moment, reimaginations of democracy in many countries, such as Kenya. And this is something that Membe talks a lot about, to really kind of unite through that idea of universal humanism, but from the kind of the African perspective. So he thinks, for example, that the West could also learn a lot from African perspectives, how this liberal democracy hasn't really worked so well, for example, in Kenya. So currently there are very interesting movements happening there, especially. Let me check what time it is. So here is my main argument in this article that I'm currently writing, that this is just a case study from the Kenyan protest that is still, of course, ongoing. So now it's more turned into this process. So it was a very kind of abrupt event last summer, but now it has just taken different forms there. So this is just a very interesting example of how you can temporarily detach from one's identity to become united. So for Deleuze, as difference is primary to this identity, to him identity kind of produces the same. So for example, if I would be now have this idea of imagination as this individual capacity, to him it would just mean that I am now just kind of thinking of already what is possible, not as something that is impossible. So you kind of need to step outside from that whole representational idea of thought itself. So to him, thought actually begins through action, through joint action in general. So it's, for example, in the Kenyan case, it could be seen that people had this just shared kind of sense that, okay, something is wrong here, and then they just became united, and then, but without a very clear blueprint of what, they didn't have one yet, at least. So it's a very interesting example. So here he's not opposing any identities, but mostly obviously how it's often captured. So identities, different power relations, nation states, or state capture in Kenyan case is often the problem in the creation of new political thought. So how to bring it forth. So that is a very interesting case. So basically, that was it from my side. Thank you. So we have some time for some questions for about 10 minutes. Yes?
I have a question.
Yes.
Thanks, Eeva, a lot. I really enjoyed this presentation. I was, actually, I was thinking about this very last page or slide where you put this political imagination as action. So I was sort of, this is not a critique or anything, but I'm just wondering, like, what is the relation between those two, right? So political imagination and action. Because on a traditional scheme, right, you would have imagination as sort of preceding, right? You imagine and then you act. Because otherwise it's utopia.
That's true.
Or is it rather, because at the end you actually brought up an interesting point that it might be actually the other way around. That you first need to act.
Yeah, precisely.
And then or are they somehow intertwined?
So this is a very
to one each other in some sense.
No, it's a very good point. And the reason I chose Deleuze for my PhD, because I found it so interesting to me, because he clearly opposes this idea of this kind of, okay, now we think and we have to have this blueprint and then you act. But to him it goes the other way around. You act and you sense first. So to him thought begins, it's first sensory, what he calls passive imagination, and then it becomes this Kantian active imagination afterwards, after action, and then kind of you regroup in a sense. So to him, thought is always like you try and go beyond the dogmatic image. So to him, I also used, this is not really a part of this presentation, but I used his less used work on his cinematic thought, so the movement and time image, so how he perceives different images, how they are created in this sense, kind of through joint action. So it's very interesting how it's kind of the other way around. Yeah.
Is that,
precisely.
Okay. Maybe.
Yeah.
What else is something else?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. Very interesting. You are discussing about method. Have you some words to say what kind of result we can hope to have about new kind of democracy? I call it ecological democracy. Have you some proposal?
Oh, what kind of democracy? I wouldn't know yet. I think it's a processual kind of democracy, perhaps. In general, let's say in Kenya, I'm not really studying only Kenya, but it's just an example here. But of course, they have various different forms of governance on the grassroots level, especially. So it's very different from here, for example. But for example, Membe talks about, he's from Cameroon. He's now in South Africa, by the way. But he talks about democracy as a community of life. And he has a big project now in many states in Africa to really get people to reimagine democracy. And this is partly because he really believes that they need to reimagine kind of this substance or substantive democracy rather than kind of procedures. So as being the creator of your own life, in a sense. So and he has been very much influenced by Foucault and Deleuze, for example. So that's why I've also chosen, and he uses Fanon as well, kind of like he has reintroduced him like to the contemporary thought. But yeah, I don't know if I answered your question because I don't have a specific democracy in my mind, but yeah. I mostly, because here the political imagination I'm studying, I'm interested in the process, the logic, what happens, that how do we actualize things, yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
The youth in the demonstration last year, so were there mostly city people all around the country, and were there some of the ethnic groups more prevalent, or was it very diverse?
No, this was what made it quite interesting, that it wasn't just because, let's say in Nairobi, the capital, you may have this idea that they have more centralized, let's say, different specific ethnic groups or more privileged, but it's not actually true. You have a lot of slums in Nairobi as well, and it's actually led by those specific youth who live in the slums, many of them. But it really brought together people from the surrounding counties. And this lasted, the biggest one was in June, when they actually invaded the parliament. But then they had smaller ones afterwards. But this has led to the current president in Kenya to be really, uneasy. So it has been quite restless since then. But currently, I'm still working with the youth and the different movements in Kenya, and they are really getting mobilized. But many of them, they're trying to become president for some reason, though, in 2027. But yeah, it definitely brought. So in Kenya, it's often been they have had a lot of ethnic violence between ethnic groups. So this was not the case. So they felt that this is like a now or never question. So they were there on the streets with, they were willing to, die for their cause, all of them. Yeah, which many of them did. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Well, if no one else is saying anything, then I could perhaps inquire about the contents of the political imagination that you're talking about. Is it really confined to the category of identity, or is there something else that you can imagine? And what are those things that you can imagine?
I don't think it's the point of imagining. It doesn't have a specific outcome, but I'm using the theoretical framework I'm using is first of all, Deleuzian framework, but it doesn't have the identity. I just gave it an example here because it's a core thing for him to kind of detach. So to him, imagination exists outside of it, outside of the self, becoming someone else, and then returning. So this is kind of the new way of thought for him. So he uses different thinkers, and this is what I'm doing in terms of, so he uses Bergson and Nietzsche as well in terms of his idea of difference. But this hasn't really been done before, like in Deleuze's work, the political imagination. He doesn't really give you like, hey, here's my theory of political imagination. To me, it's evident. So to me, that's why the ontological aspect is crucial as well, because often it's been, there's, of course, Deleuze is a bit of a complex thinker perhaps, and very highly up to interpretation naturally, but it often just, it's about these becomings in his interpretation in his work. But to me, he talks a lot about his whole idea of the virtual. To me, it's imagination. That's how I'm trying to kind of, that's my interpretation anyway. So I find it very interesting, and especially in his work in his cinematic books, where he talks about the images and how they're formulated, how to kind of get rid of them or clear them first, how we can create new ones. So I find it interesting that I don't think he has a specific identity in mind, because he wants us to create new identities, new things, but not according to the logic that we are used to, thinking about how we create them. Because to him, the way we are currently creating them, we are just creating the same. So yes.
Can I push you a bit further?
Sure.
The thing, if the problem is that we tend to reproduce the same.
Yes.
But what is this same? Is this something else than identity? Is it something like social relations, practices, institutions?
Well, yes, I would say all of them here. How I refer to identities, they're all of them. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But of course, they're often captured. So if we think about us like this, the virtual and actual, so you try and it kind of derives from the virtual all the time, but then it gets captured, and then it just becomes kind of segmented again. So then that's, I think, the problem in a sense, but then if we kind of turn it around, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
Yeah, maybe just a quick, yeah.
Yeah, we have
Just
1 minute.
Just to follow up on the last remark.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was thinking when you speak about imagining and becoming other, and I know you're not necessarily focusing on identities, but it seems that it's always sort of, it's somehow more easier to think of, okay, I have an identity, let's be otherwise, right? Rather than thinking of a, you know, a community or
Yeah.
some other collective identity. So how does imagination? Yeah, because you said in the beginning.
Yeah.
Imagination is a creative faculty of the subject, yeah? So
One
how
of
does
the
one
ways to
actually-
approach it.
How does one approach it, and how does one indeed practice it collectively? Yeah? I mean, it's just, I think it's kind of a general problem, I think, in this type of... because it's somehow very clear to think that, okay, you can somehow act otherwise or be otherwise. But when you try to apply it to
Yes.
collective
Yeah, so for-
morality, then it's different.
Yeah, that is true. So for me, how Deleuze kind of approaches it is that it is already, the default is the plurality of it. So you kind of need to do it through action in any case. So here, I'm not sure if I said it here, because I'm not really studying, or I'm less interested in imagination as a mental faculty. So I'm not really approaching it as a faculty of the subject. So that's why it's, I think it's just, imagination is something that is the ontology that he talks about. So then it just becomes something else. So the imagination is here, and then it needs to kind of actualize itself. But it doesn't really have an agency itself. Imagination doesn't do anything on its own. So, but it doesn't only happen through the subject either. So it's kind of like a plurality, I think, to him already in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, but what would be the paradigm of that? Like social movements or a state or a community of elders? I don't know. I'm just drawing things out of
No, it's just the process that is interesting to me in terms of like, so for example, the Kenyan case, it kind of begun through the sensory, the kind of passive imagination, and then it was actualized. So that was kind of the logic there in terms of how to just, yes, to become in a sense. So there the imagination was kind of this, faceless ontology that just took its own form through that plural collective action in that sense. Yeah. Yes.
Can you say something? This is to find a new identity is something that, as we say, Aufhebung. Dus generell will always some kind of resonance between the people who are working or acting.
What do you mean?
Resonance, I mean that we have the common, how to say, feeling and ideas and so. But Aufhebung means that we find some more common level of abstraction to find the basis for action. It's a quite different way of thinking.
Yes. Yeah. True. Yeah, I think the abstractions are a core part of his thought. He talks about this in his work on the Arabic Revolution in the before 1920s, on the book on T.E. Lawrence, when he was there and kind of creating in his book on the Pillars of Wisdom. So where he would just kind of create these shared abstractions with the Arabic soldiers, even though they didn't really have they had a shared vision. But I think it's really like an interesting kind of this mixture of this kind of a post-phenomenological idea of how we then produce this collective action. So yeah, I think this kind of like shared images is a core part for him, how to produce. in those movements. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. We can move on to the next speaker. Let me put you here, Max. Just a second. Yes, there we go. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eeva, for your introduction and for kindly inviting me to take part in this event. My name is Max Talberg, and I'm the founder and chairperson of the Global Visions Association. And welcome everyone on my behalf as well. So the topic for my presentation today is on the importance of envisioning a better future. And I will approach the themes of this talk through three background questions, which are: first, why is it important to envision a better future? Secondly, what could these future visions look like? And then finally, how could we get there or move towards these visions? Yeah, so first of all, in today's world, it's of course easy to lose hope in the prospect of a better world and future. Many feel, of course, and maybe rightly so, that we are heading towards major disruptions in the not too distant future. At the same time, the threats we face are in many ways also larger than ever before, as they encompass the whole of humanity in many ways. And at the same time also change is happening at a faster pace than ever before, be that concerning climate change or international relations or technological developments. So I feel that to navigate these changes in a positive way, we would need a new kind of approach to both decision-making, cooperation and governance, one that considers the well-being of the entire world and all its inhabitants. Yeah, so given this perspective, it's of course understandable that many people feel that we are heading towards some kind of global destruction in the future. And this is of course is in many ways a rational thing to say and feel, but I would still argue that this does not reflect the full realities of the possibilities of today and tomorrow. I would instead argue that there's always room for hope, for envisioning a better world, and most importantly for finding solutions together. And in a world where change happens more rapidly than ever before, the threats may be larger than ever before, but I would also argue that so are the possibilities and opportunities if we can harness this change for the greater good. So, and this brings me to my first question. So, why is it important to envision a better future? For me, the first key point here is that the future is never predetermined, no matter how inevitable or likely certain predictions may appear at the present moment. We always have the power to influence the events of the world and the developments of the world, even though we may not always understand this and realize this. And also, if we fail to investigate the potential solutions that we have today and for tomorrow as well, then we cannot also expect ourselves to seize the opportunities for positive change when they arise. And they will inevitably arise regardless of how likely it is that we'll take the right decisions then. It's also highly likely that in the future, maybe even in the near future, we will face multiple turning points which might be seen as decisive moments that shape humanity's trajectory for generations to come. We can of course not predict the decisions that will be taken then, but we can already start to imagine the possible solutions to these issues and problems. And in that way also increase the likelihood of these decisions being taken then when the moment arises. So given these thoughts, I would actually argue that it's now more important than ever before to envision a better world and also look for solutions. To bring about positive change, we must first have a vision to head for, know where we want to go to, and also how to get there. This applies, of course, to the initial steps of this process, but maybe even to a final goal of some sort, which could be an aspiration for humanity and our planet that we can all strive towards. And this is where the Global Visions Association comes into play. Our mission is to serve as a platform for dialogue on improving the world both today and tomorrow, and particularly from a global perspective. And we also believe that the best solutions are those that at least to some extent can be accepted by all, and that the joint positive impacts of these solutions would also be the greatest. And then this brings me to the second question, which was, what could these future visions look like then? For me, we should first look, in order to answer this question, we should first look at the individual and collective well-being of the human being as a species and as a biological entity, and also at how we function as an individual and a species. So we'll just briefly investigate this first. There's of course a lot more to say about this. And one other key point for me is that in many ways human nature has remained unchanged throughout history, and our actions continue still to be influenced by fundamental aspects of our existence. One such crucial insight is that we at core are social beings, driven by a complex mix of forces and motivations. Many of them stem from our biology and evolutionary history. We of course know that we can act in self-serving and destructive ways, but also in rational, altruistic and compassionate ways. And once again, our deep social nature means that we seek connection with each other, while also desiring, of course, personal well-being. When we look at the modern society and our issues, one idea that I have is that we might maybe conclude that many of today's personal and societal issues stem from the fact that we no longer live in a way that aligns with our natural human tendencies. If you look at, for instance, fame or social media popularity or wealth, we can say that they do not seem to bring happiness to people. Instead, I would argue that meaningful relationships, shared values and goals that transcend individual interest are what the true sources of fulfillment, both on a personal and collective level. One could even maybe argue that such well-being is somehow imprinted in the human mind and body, and the reported happiness of individuals in modern hunter-gatherer societies may support this notion. It's of course difficult to give any definitive answers, but we can always think about the possible mechanisms behind these things. So considering these insights, I feel that we should now rediscover meaning and well-being through our connections with each other and by working towards the betterment of the world. It's very clear that we cannot be happy alone, at least the vast majority of us cannot be happy alone. Life, of course, may not have a universal meaning, but I feel that it's not difficult for the individual to find meaningful endeavors to do in their life that also benefit other people as well. And as we should focus on community and cooperation, we must also remember to respect individuality, but not becoming fixated on it. For me, perhaps the most fundamental question for humanity is how we can live together in a way that balances both individual and collective well-being. For me, the key question here would be to create a world where everyone would have a fair chance of realizing their potential, and then the individual well-being and prosperity that this would lead to should then at least partly be directed back into society, in my opinion to a large amount actually, to enhance the collective well-being of all. So I feel that our goal should be a society where individual and collective well-being are balanced in an optimal way, and this balance has at least to some extent been achieved in the past in societies and communities, as pointed out for instance by Amartya Sen and other people as well. And in many ways this should be a goal once again, but this well-being should now encompass the whole of the world and humanity. This would not be an impossible thing to do either. Even though we know how humans usually function and react to things, this does not mean that any behaviors or reactions would be inevitable in any way. So for me, the key to shaping the future may lie in how we, as individuals, groups and members of society, perceive and experience the world, but most importantly are motivated and incentivized to act within the world through this perception and experience. And history has of course shown that people's actions can indeed of course be influenced. This has unfortunately often been done by elites who shape societal norms to serve their own interests. And we have of course seen that masses of people can be manipulated into greatly harming one another under such influences. Yet I would also argue that the opposite is also true. Humanity also has the potential to act constructively and benevolently to each other. Consider for instance the transformative movements led by Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela, or more recently Greta Thunberg. All of these examples demonstrate that under the right conditions human beings can come together for positive change. For me the challenge here lies in channeling this potential in a positive way, and also in a way that aligns with our natural social instincts and moral inclinations. And then also throughout history, humanity has always also envisioned a better world. For instance, the ancient Greeks and Romans spoke of cosmopolitanism and natural law, and later on philosophers such as Hegel conceived history as moving toward a higher purpose or even some kind of an end goal in itself. So the inclination to envision a better world seems deeply enrooted into human nature, which also gives us reason to believe that it could still be important and worthwhile, and that things could be achieved through this envisioning. So what then could a vision of a better world look like on a more tangible level? I would argue that we already possess many of the potential answers to this question, and that they may be also in the end point towards a surprisingly similar end goal, which might resemble the end goal I outlined earlier. And some of these answers and visions are already ancient and for instance shared by many of the world religions, or for instance the previously mentioned idea of cosmopolitanism, which also is really old. Others then are of course more recent, but maybe they also share some kind of basis in history. And maybe one could also argue that they in some profound way all are universal, at least maybe universal to some extent. What could then these answers look like today? In my opinion, they include concepts such as human rights, democracy, and the welfare state. They're all partly modern answers that point towards a society and world where the rights, viewpoints, and welfare of everyone are secured and considered, and also where personal and collective well-being is balanced in an optimal way. And this ideal has at least partly already been achieved in the past in local communities and societies, as pointed out by Sen, for instance. And today I would argue that they can best be realized in the Nordic welfare countries. If you look at these solutions in a little bit more detail, one could argue that human rights give us the rights and principles that should be respected, and then democracy, the possibility of hearing from all sides and making sure that everyone takes part in societal discussions, and also that everyone has a chance to defend their rights, which could be outlined by human rights, for instance, at least a part of them. And then the welfare state could give us the goal to head for, where both the real ideals of human rights and democracy are realized in a way through which also collective welfare is optimized. So the future goal for humanity then, starting from today, would be to secure this welfare on a global level, harnessing the potential of each individual and improving everyone's life through this then. And this then brings me to the third question: how could we get towards a vision of a better world? My opinion is that we get towards this vision by discussing different possibilities with people from different backgrounds and fields of knowledge. And for example, at Global Visions, we have already examined some of these possible solutions and answers. We have been interested in the concept of a basic income, both on a societal level and even as a global project, interviewing different experts on this issue. And the past year we also focused on the Global South in a bit more detail, interviewing people from smaller communities as well as people representing larger movements, such as the Debt for Climate, for instance. And we'll continue to investigate this subject also this year that's just started. If you once again return to the idea of utilizing the full potential of humanity, I would argue that one cannot overlook the possibilities and potential of the immigrant communities all around the world. We have been interested in this as well, also in the situation in Finland, but also on a global level, because we have been interested in the idea of the free movement of people, interviewing Professor Alex Sager of the University of Portland on this issue a few years ago. And then we hold our annual State of the World event at the end of the year, where we look at the current problems the world is facing, because we believe that the best solutions can only be found if we look at the problems we are facing today. We are also interested in innovations for the future. We had an event on artificial intelligence and how it relates to democracy, human rights, and the Global South. And then this year we'll hold 3 events. The first one looks into how we could possibly solve climate change. The second one looks at the solution of a global carbon tax to this problem. And then at the end of the year, we will once again have our annual State of the World event. And videos of all these events are available on our webpage. Yes, but once again, for me, the key for positive change is to equip the whole of humanity with the right conditions to discuss, imagine, and implement solutions. At the heart of this lies the quest for us to come together in a productive and positive way. And we already have evidence that people can indeed agree on difficult questions even though they might not share the first initial viewpoints on them. If we once again examine the nature of the human being, one could argue that we are usually friendly to people, even to people coming from a different background, but this necessitates that we get to know them first on a personal level. If we would remember this, for instance, and use this in a productive way, then positive change is possible if we come together in a productive way. And this is also evident, for instance, in the deliberative democracy discussions held in Ireland on abortion earlier, which many deemed to be a success. And then finally, I would also argue that there are genuine reasons for real hope and optimism today also. For instance, on an absolute level, global welfare is higher today than ever before, as evidenced, for instance, by rising levels of education and economic development. And additionally, humanity has the access to more knowledge across all scientific fields and technological fields as well, more than ever before in history. And this would also suggest that our ability to develop solutions that benefit everyone is now greater than ever. And then also, of course, the potential of scientific and technological progress is vast, and we might not have the slightest clue of what could be achieved in the next 50 to 200 years, for instance. We could maybe even be able to solve many of the current problems through this, but we of course don't know how things will work out. And today we also understand human behavior better than ever before, both on a personal and collective level. And thus we could also have the tools to impact this in a positive way. But all of this, however, necessitates that we manage these possibilities together. And so at Global Visions, we believe that the best solutions that point towards a brighter future are such that they can, at least to some extent, be accepted by all, and that the joint benefits of these solutions might be the greatest to all of humanity. For us to, for instance, solve climate change, we must solve it for all of humanity, because if we are not able to do this, then all of humanity will pay the price, including those who are now in the most privileged position. If we would come together in this productive and right way, we would surely realize that there's much more that we have in common than what separates us from each other. Maybe the visions we have as individuals might in the end also be surprisingly similar, and we would maybe realize this if we would just discuss them in an open and transparent way and without prejudice. And then finally, humanity would also come really far if we just took the time to examine the scientific knowledge we have about ourselves today and how we function together. These facts include the fact that immigration does not lead to increased criminality, or that the variation between individual human beings is much larger than the variation between groups, or that inequality leads to declined well-being even for the most privileged ones in a society, or that human rights and democracy are desired all around the world, and then instead autocracy, corruption and wars are rejected. Remembering such universal political facts and utilizing them in the right way through a joint discussion where we look for common global solutions is for me the best way for us to build a better world today and in the future. Okay, thank you. Yeah, room for questions as well.
Well, I must say I'm not so optimistic as you are.
Yeah, I don't know.
Let's take the ecological realism. It's impossible that this way of life we have is to be able to everyone in this earth. We have 10 billion people. It's impossible. So it's a question of sharing the resources of the thin texture of life.
Yeah.
And how we can do it. Perhaps Heikki can say something about it. I mean this enormous task of education and civilization to understand how we can manage it.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm...
The time point is we have 10 or let's say 40 or 30 years time.
Yeah. I'm not sure if I'm super optimistic, but I just want to point out that there's always room also for solutions. And we don't know how things might work out, but there's of course many big questions that we need to solve. And of course regarding the climate and the economy as well, of course, we need to find this welfare in a sustainable way, but maybe one idea would be to focus on social well-being. and maybe focus on communality as well, not on individualism, which is a great harm or a bad thing that we are doing today and have been doing for a long while as well. Yes, Eeva?
Yes, I noticed you called something like a virtual, what was it called? Virtual citizenship?
Yeah.
And that's something super interesting. Could you say a few words about that?
Well, that's our way of looking at cosmopolitanism today.
Okay.
Yeah, but this is just like a vision for the future, and I started the Global Visions project by writing a book where I looked at two ideas, and those were the free movement of people and then global basic income at the same time. I'm not sure if this would be good solutions in the end, but it's interesting to look at this and look at the world where these two would be realized for every human being at the same time. That could be one way of looking at our project for the global citizenship. But for me the key is to enable everyone to reach their potential and also to do it in a smart way as well. And I would focus on maybe the good thing about basic income would be that it could maybe enable people to have more freedom and then be able to do something that they really feel passionate about. That could be one good way of looking at it, but then at the same time it could also lead to passivity. So I'm not sure, but we are just discussing this idea, and there are of course pros and cons to every idea that we have today. But it's interesting to look at the possibilities and maybe envisioning a bit more into the future, because things might look really different in 100 years and also in a positive way. You never know. Yes.
Yes. We talk a lot about humanity, and I was thinking, have Global Visions considered animal exploitations and building a better world for all sentient and living beings on the planet, and not just excluding everybody else?
Yeah. We have actually we wrote a blog text about the potential of a plant-based diet. Also when it comes to climate change. It was a few years ago, but actually the potential of if everybody would transition to a plant-based diet, the potential would be really huge when it comes to climate change as well. And then of course technological innovations might enable us to do this, maybe. I don't know, I'm not an expert of this, but that could maybe be the most important single thing that the individual human being could do. And this could then lead to a much more sustainable way of facing climate change. Yeah. Yes, please.
Hello. Yes. Thank you very much for your point and the previous points as well. There's a term that I've come across recently that I think ties in with a lot of these themes. It's a two-part term, planetary citizenship, and I wonder whether this is something you or anybody else here has come across. In the sense of combining the idea of belonging to the ecosphere and to the biosphere, as well as the word citizenship implying social connections and social construct as well, which you've been touching on. And for me, what this really means is the need to foster emotional connections to nature and the methods and the processes of nature and us as part of this as well, while at the same time approaching one another in this shared vision. I really appreciate this entire mode of conversation and these themes you're touching on. And what really I wonder about are the methods through which we could attain these emotional experiences throughout different cultures and throughout different societies and different ways of framing, both within and outside of religion, for example, and spiritual connections, and beyond optimism and pessimism, if at all possible, in a meta-modern sort of sense. So there's an idea I'd like to ask you about, which is enchantment. In Finnish, this is known as haltioituminen. It's a very, very basic premise of Finno-Ugric beliefs and of beliefs around the world. But this idea of enchantment in animism, of seeing existence as soulful and having soul. There's a researcher called Helena Karhu from the University of Eastern Finland, and I've recently proofread an article by her on this very, very topic. So I'm wondering about enchantment, and I'm wondering about these emotional connections to planetary citizenship as well, and also some taboo topics which may or may not lead in this direction concerning mental health and consciousness as well. So how do you feel about one or sum of these things.
Well, I haven't really heard about those specific topics or ideas, but yeah, I would still say that it's really key for us to be in contact with nature, and that might be one of the reasons for the reported well-being in the modern hunter-gatherer societies. I'm not an expert on this, but I feel that this is one key point. And if I go to the forest, I immediately notice that I'm feeling much better and calmer. So there's something in our body that also enables this. So yeah, I think being more in contact with nature is one thing, and then also meeting different people, because as I just mentioned, usually if you meet a new person without prejudice and give a chance to this person, then you can at least agree on something and recognize the common humanity that you share and so on. So it would be important to come together in different forums and ways, and then connect to nature at the same time. Those are two quite important topics in my opinion.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
All right. I'm going to talk about the book that came out 1.5 years ago called World Statehood, The Future of World Politics, that involves a lot of imagining in all kinds of ways. And let me just show first the cover of the book. There are reasons why we need to imagine things in a novel way. Plenty of them. As you can see from this, starting from the top, there are many global problems that we need to tackle. As you can see, we have things like economic instability in the world economy. We have climate emergency. We have already exceeded the official target of 1.5 Celsius decrease, and it seems to me that there is no hope without geoengineering to actually retain that target. There will have to be other targets. There's the extinction crisis and other ecological problems because of globalization and the increasing dominance of humanity over the other life forms on the planet. There's a more increasing likelihood of pandemics. We have rising inequalities in global political economy, particularly within countries. We have the possibility of a nuclear war at one point in late 22, when during the Ukrainian war, the CIA actually estimated that the likelihood of the use of nuclear weapons was 50%. And we have also the possibility of various runaway technological developments as well. Recently we've been discussing a lot artificial intelligence, but there are many other related problems as well. So by using nanotechnologies, we can actually build robots, very small robots that behave in the same way as certain viruses, for instance. So we have plenty of things, all kinds of problems to resolve. The second is that the problem is that our political imagination, despite all these problems being global or planetary in character, our political imagination remains captive of state sovereignty. And in fact, what has been happening during the past 20 years or so, this has been reinforced by various powerful tendencies in global political economy. So despite the fact that our fates are deeply interconnected, the world seems to be disintegrating, if anything. And of course, from a planetary perspective, there are also other possible threats as well. So you may know the film Don't Look Up. So it's a story about a comet coming towards planet Earth, and then finally, when it's already within the reach of human eyes, normal eyesight, the people they develop these ideas and even political movements that we shouldn't be looking up, we should be looking down, and some people say that now this becomes too polarized. Some people are looking up, some people down, so we should be looking both up and down, and so on. Of course, it ends in a disaster, but it's an allegory for climate change. So that's a very important part. Anyway, it is also it is also true that the planet faces cosmic risks as well. Those include solar storms, asteroids, and meteors of all kinds. And we can see the war in Ukraine in both ways. It is clearly an instance of global interconnectedness. I mean, many people from places like India or Brazil or South Africa or whatever, they say that or Indonesia, they couldn't have imagined how much this war in Europe actually has affected their lives. And then, of course, obviously, if it escalates into a nuclear war, I mean, then it certainly will affect everyone on the planet. But it's also an instance of political imagination being captive of state sovereignty and the nation as well. Because wars between identities in that way are very much based on that sort of categorization of the human part of the world. Now, in the book where I discuss the idea of world statehood, the idea is not simply to imagine a kind of a replicate of the existing states on a global scale, but rather the book is based on the primacy of the idea of primacy of processes. And so when I'm talking about world statehood, the existence of something like world statehood, or the layer of world statehood, is not a categorical yes or no question. But in fact, we already have some elements of world statehood in place. So in the book, I first ask whether and to what degree elements of world statehood exist already. Think about near-constitutional arrangements of global economy, the basic principles of the WTO, etc. I mean, they like near-constitutionally locking particular arrangements of economic policy. We also have an idea that there's something like a constitutional order in place in terms of human rights, that this provides some kind of a basis for a worldwide community. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is from 1948. And there are other elements as well, global civil society and various systems of public sphere as well. Then the question is whether in terms of these processes, something like this layer could be strengthened, and particularly as a response to many of these global problems. And some people even argue that world state, given all these problems and given the nature of these processes, is in fact inevitable. In international relations, there are scholars who make this argument, and so I ask also whether it is in some sense inevitable or not. And then, of course, once this layer of world statehood has become stronger, the question becomes also whether it can be sustained, because there are many forms of state, including federations, that have failed and they have collapsed at some point in world history. Now, as far as political imagination is concerned, one of the key things and starting points is that there's no center on the surface of the planet. I mean, this might sound like a truism, but in fact it is not, because so many people are imagining that the center lies here in Western Europe, and maybe Eurocentric, or in North America, or in some other particular location. The Middle Kingdom is China. So you have different ways of imagining where the center is. But I make the argument also in other ways. The thinking about the current state of the world, which started with the mechanical revolution of the early 19th century, as a result of which the world economy is now something like 80 times bigger than it was in 1820s. So that's a huge process, and of course, obviously, it has led to many of these ecological and other problems that we are facing. Now, very often, from a Eurocentric perspective, it is something that happened in Europe inevitably, because Europe was somehow different, the culture was different, there was Protestant ethic, there was rationality, there were all kinds of other things. Or alternatively, it is also possible to argue that the Industrial Revolution was due to the particular social arrangements that occurred and emerged in Europe for similar kinds of reasons, particularly modern state and capitalist market economy. However, in the book I argue that the Industrial Revolution, even though it was inevitable in one sense of the term, as a total process, it was totally contingent where and when it would happen. It could have happened already in the Song dynasty China in the 11th and 12th century, and there were many other possibilities as well. The Arabic world before the Italian Renaissance was very close to this stage, and there were other parts in the world, and some of these elements were already present much earlier, like there was a lot of monetization in Persia, 600 BCE. Anyway, it just happened to happen in Europe, but it was inevitable. It would have happened anyway. Things were taking, the processes were taking things that way. And there's a lot of discussion in the book about the nature of time and temporality and these processes, historical processes, and whether they have any directionality or not. And in fact, I argue this also in the context of a wider processes of the cosmic evolution as well. There are nested purposes and related identities, and even though there's no deterministic relationship between these, they are connected in many ways. And from this perspective, I discuss also the idea of big history. One motivation for big history has been precisely to create some kind of a planetary identity. And I critically comment on that, and one of the key methodological underpinnings of that argument is that we can use mythopoetic imagination as critique, as a form of critique. And this is what I do. I try to actually comment upon the biggest story that there is, I mean the grand narrative that is prevalent in our society, that is based on some sort of arbitrariness of life on Earth, on the idea that we are heading towards death, not life, that the biological world is Darwinist in some vulgar sense of the term, and that all this is meaningless. And I argue against some of these ideas in terms of the most recent scientific discoveries and theories, stressing the notion of emergence and complexity, and then situating the developments on our planet in that kind of a context. And of course, the key point is what happens in the contemporary world and after the industrial mechanical revolution of the 19th century and in the contemporary situation, when that has led to further development that has made in a way the situation that Kant envisioned in the late 18th century true, that humanity is facing, just because of the development of the technologies of destruction, a situation where it is either the graveyard of humanity as a whole or some alternative way of organizing our common life on a planetary scale. So this is the starting point. The book actually develops this from a perspective of the second and the third part of the book are about the contemporary developments and the development of systems of global governance and the underlying forces of political economy. I also discuss the disintegrative tendencies that are prevalent in the contemporary world and so on and so forth. In the third part, I also discuss some concrete ideas about how things could change and how this layer of world statehood could become stronger and more responsive to the global problems that we are facing. And one of the key ideas is that once there's a kind of a breakthrough in one area of global governance, that can provide a model for many other systems of governance as well. And in the context of climate change, if it is possible to establish something like a global greenhouse gas tax, that's the first global tax ever in the world, and it would set the scene for thinking about the future of global governance in a very different way, and what I call the green global Keynesian way. We've known the existence of climate change at least since the mid-20th century. In some ways, some individuals knew something about those mechanisms already in the 19th century. It has been common knowledge since the 1980s at the latest, and very little has been done so far. We have some systems of emission trading, and one of the key arguments of that chapter is that they are not working particularly well. Even the Kyoto Agreement, if it had been realized in full, would have been able to reduce global warming by 0.1 Celsius degrees. And in a situation we have already exceeded 1.5 Celsius degrees in global warming. So global greenhouse gas tax, although it is not alone a solution to this problem, would be a major step forward in terms of doing something about the underlying powerful forces, transition to post-fossil fuel global economy, and at the same time it would also create public resources for this transition and for mitigating the impact of climate change in different parts of the world. And this has to do with things like climate justice as well. And then this raises the question that was already there in the 18th century at the time of the American Revolution, when the revolutionaries said, we don't agree that you can tax us without us being represented. No taxation without representation. So this actually opens the question of global democracy as well. There's a lot of discussion in the book about agency as well, and I developed particularly the idea of a world political party in this context as well. There are already elements like world political parties in the world, but they are not particularly visible for most people. They are not very well organized. In some cases, they are more regional than global, even though they are also globally or trying to mobilize things on a global scale. One of them is DiEM25 in Europe. There are a couple of other attempts in that direction. I take part in a process called Great Transition Initiative, and the idea is now to move to the next step, which comes very close to the idea of a world political party. Anyway, if we set this in the context of this growing complexity and emergence of new kinds of things, we can also discuss the possibility of there being some kind of a rational, tendentional directionality of world history. But even if it can establish something like that, it is necessarily contingent on transformative practice. And this has to be organized one way or the other. So to think about this in terms of citizenship or in terms of political participation and political organization, I mean, the obvious next step is to globalize politics as well, and not least in terms of political parties. And then the idea is that there are three different moments in the process of transformation in this regard. Given the current situation, I mean, these kinds of, like global civil society more generally, they can act within the confines of established institutions and try to create a momentum for transformations, either by creating new institutions or by democratizing or otherwise transforming the existing institutions. Then in the second moment, when something like this happens, imagine that there's a global greenhouse gas tax with a representative body and participatory body as well. Then this party obviously plays a role in the politics of that organization and institution. And by playing that role, it can further other transformations as well. So it's a process where one thing can lead to another, and the whole point is to create some kind of a basis for a virtuous circle of transformation. Another idea is that of a world parliament. This idea is an old one. It was first proposed already during the French Revolution in the 1790s. And for instance, during the First World War, when there was a campaign for the establishment of the League of Nations, many people like H.G. Wells were thinking that the League of Nations would have to have at its core a world parliament, elected world parliament. And at the moment, currently, in the 2000s, there's a campaign for the United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. It is less ambitious than some of the past ideas, but it is a similar kind of an idea. Now, the problem with these different visions about the World Parliament is twofold. On the one hand, very often it is assumed that the only place is to talk. The parlamentum literally actually means it's from Latin, means a place to talk. Parla and mentum. Now, but that is not particularly transformative. So the United Nations Parliamentary Assembly, in many of its proposed variations, wouldn't take things very far. The other possibility that it would be some kind of a sovereign legislative body on a global scale, legislating the whole world. That is not only utopian, but it is also problematic because it can also create counter tendencies and counter forces that might lead to something like a global civil war. And so that's problematic too. So one of the key ideas there, to use political imagination, is to think about the underpinnings of World Parliament in a different way. So rather than being a legislative body or just a place to talk, it would be the body that in a way determines what the international law is. The problem is because there's no Supreme Court or no obligatory courts in international law, it is the states, separate states, that can say that or make the argument that this is legal and this is not legal. So for instance, when the United States and the British invaded Iraq in 2003, most international lawyers say that this is illegal. All the other members of the Security Council of the United Nations said it's illegal. All the lawyers of the United States and the United Kingdom were arguing it's totally legal. And they were citing a number of decisions made by the UN Security Council and a number of treaties and other common things about the international law as evidence. And nobody can actually decide what the law in that kind of a situation is. The same holds true, for instance, if there's a conflict between the WTO and human rights. Now, an elected World Parliament could do just that. It could be a kind of a democratic Supreme Court of the world, saying that this is the correct interpretation of international law. And then, over time, obviously, because the line between interpreting the law and making the law is, of course, thin, it would increasingly assume, or could assume, powers in that regard. But it would have to make decisions about that. So there must be other preparations in place. But the World Parliament can do another thing as well. It could be the body that coordinates these different functional organizations, like, let's say, financial transaction tax or greenhouse gas tax, or some other bodies, for instance, International Clearing Union, World Central Bank, and other possible bodies that we all need for controlling some of these processes and powers in global political economy. So it could be the coordinating body of other bodies that are responsible for only organizing certain kinds of activities. So this would be a layer of world statehood without there being a single center anywhere. And it's an evolving processual whole. And that's the whole idea. And of course, the final question concerns whether once something like this is in place, it's an open-ended process. World history is open-ended, even though there can be a rational tendential directionality. The history is still open-ended in many ways. And then we can ask questions whether the outcome, which is itself evolving, is sustainable or not. And this concerns things like the legitimacy of these entities that exist. It concerns also how political identities are organized. And there are all kinds of problems. It's a tricky question, and in chapter 13 I go in great detail in assessing different theories about these kinds of possibilities. But ultimately, legitimacy and sustainability of something like a world political community that also requires planetary political imagination, that there can be other layers and other identities as well, but it also requires some kind of a common identity too. This is dependent on particular way of organizing self-other relations, which has to be based on a form of pluralism that is based on the recognition of the legitimacy of all kinds of differences in the world. So this is the idea about the outcome, the end of the process, that there is no end, that this is a continuously and openly developing totality, and that any process can always fail and end in a collapse as well. So the basic point is that there is hope and there's optimism about the future, but I mean we can easily fail unless we are aware of all the risks and problems that there are. Thank you.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Who would like to start? Yes, please. It's you.
Hello, I'm Timo from Siemenpuu Foundation. We are supporting environmental organization and ecological democracy initiatives in the global south in different countries. And from there we have got a little bit different kind of view actually there for the systemic change maybe which is needed for the change this current economic and political systems. So then there is more tendency towards local scale, like a very localized representation and initiatives to make life more sustainable and for example regarding the commons or and bringing women ecofeminism and this kind of issues. So it seems that there's from the current level is two ways. One way is to the global politics, and the other way would be localization. We have published a website where there are articles from the writers from the global south. Some of the articles are translated from the book Blue Rivers, the Post-Development Dictionary, which is edited by, for example, Asis Kotari and Gustavo Esteva, some of the editors of the book. And I have some of the brochures. These are only in Finnish, but they are available under the coffee pot and for me as well. So to have that, there is so many different ways of thinking the future sustainability and others. So what do you think of this? That are they opposing ways, or are they more like working together in the same direction?
They can be working together, but they are not necessarily. If you only focus on local initiatives, I mean, then you even if you succeed locally, I mean, you leave the rest of the planet totally intact. I mean, all these things can happen. I mean, whether we are talking about nuclear war or total ecological disaster or whatever, I mean, they can still happen. I mean, you can be locally doing the right thing, but I mean, nothing changes on a global scale. On the other hand, you can have all kinds of global arrangements as well that are simply speeding up the processes in a way that is very problematic, and we can actually reinforce some of these problematic tendencies as well. So there's no panacea in terms of locality or globality. You have to organize them in a particular way. But I can easily imagine, and for instance, the use of regulations and taxes to make food production more local. So you can actually make it much more expensive to take salmon from Norway to South Africa, to process it there and then take it back to Europe and sell it in the supermarkets or something like that. So that's not ecologically particularly sustainable. So you can give a price. I mean, for instance, a tax on transportation of certain kinds of things would do the trick quite well, because I mean they're playing with small margins. So you can organize things on a global scale in a manner that also improves the possibility of doing certain kinds of things more locally. Yes, Eeva.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on this pluriversal thought I think it's very typical to kind of put them as this binary, that the pluriverse, only the local, as if like it's a threat, or the universal would be the threat to that. But I definitely agree that they can coexist. I think it's just a matter of organizing it, plus, yes, so how we understand the universal organization.
Exactly.
But I do think that they are definitely connected, because I think if we think about like some kind of planetary organization that goes beyond the nation state, I think it's definitely serving then the local organization as well, you know, because the nation state is not perhaps the best, you know, way to also serve the local needs, at least in many like newer nation states in Africa. I think that's why they also really pursue these like local based.
Yeah, if you look at the history of the construction of national states, I mean, that has been a very homogenizing process, so very often in a very violent manner as well. Matti Väsä-Junti.
Thank you. Two questions. Excellent. You used the word expressions hollow reflexes institution and nested orders. Can you a little open what you mean this? And the second one, your Keynesian idea. What do you think? What's the difference, or is there any difference between the public and private capitalization of future from the point of view of nature? Because we have to have some kind of difference if you think that the statehood is the solution of that.
Yeah, that's the old big question. Solar reflexivity means that the term hollow comes from the word whole. So you're talking about the planetary whole. And hollow reflexivity means reflexivity that concerns planetary sized processes and how we can actually shape them. And so whenever, for instance, we are talking about climate change and responses to climate change, we are already engaging with hollow reflexivity. It's already there. And so it encompasses the entire planet and all the different cultures, civilizations, states, or whatever, because we are all in the same system. The whole is interconnected. And this applies to the economy as well. I mean, for instance, if you simply think about the Keynesian multiplier, which is one of the ways of the states to induce economic growth, that might be problematic also from the ecological point of view. But the point there is that there's interconnectedness. If you stimulate the economy in one place, I mean, part of that goes to other countries. And it depends on their responses what the total net outcome is. If you cooperate and you coordinate activities and you create institutions that can do that, you are much better off than if you compete. Now we are in a process where the actors are responding to others in tit for tat terms, and the response can be catastrophic. So you need to be reflexive about planetary developments, and at the same time understand also the ways in which not only ecological things or the problem of nuclear war, but our everyday practices through the world economy are deeply interconnected as well. So if we want to change something, I mean, we need to engage in this sort of reflexivity. The nested purposes, I don't know whether I have the time to explain that, but the idea is that we can start with very personal purposes that are here and now, and they sometimes might be very strategic, or sometimes they might be ethical as well, but they're confined to a particular thing. Then you start to realize that, I mean, this is in part dependent on social relations, and you take into account a wider community at the third level that might be a big whole, a complex whole like the nation or something like that. But that is actually also encapsulated by much wider purposes, whether we're talking about planetary or go even beyond that and imagine the development of humanity in cosmic terms. What's the purpose and point of all this?
Do you want more?
Perhaps.
Okay, maybe two then.
Yes.
Quick ones.
Quick one. But how in our everyday life experience we can manage to open the whole statehood or the whole reflexive position? We are asked to be that kind of consumer, but how about in the working life?
Well, in many ways we can see the interconnections already in contemporary world. In one of my papers I actually used some concrete but also imagined individuals living in different places, including a cleaner in Kenya, working for a Finnish embassy there. And the Finnish state starts to apply austerity and then cuts down embassies in the world, and then this cleaner that is actually supporting an entire family is unemployed. And all these things are connected. And the similar way, you can see that whatever we are consuming, whatever we are doing here is actually dependent on all these commodity chains. The world economy is fluctuating. There are all kinds of crises. When a global financial crisis or euro crisis comes, it affects everyday life. I mean, everything that we do, I mean, this computer, I mean, couldn't have been produced in Finland. The whole internet system, all these technologies that we are using in our everyday life, that's part of the planetary economy. And so it's a matter of actually perceiving what is already real.
Just one very quick question as well. Thank you again. In terms of world parliament or global democracy and curtailing processes that are destructive or are based in I guess, broken psychological systems as well, and psychological well-being that's been completely sort of thrown away. How do boycotts, divestments, and sanctions come in these types of systems as is being conducted against genocidal Israel right now, and which has actually produced dramatic results?
That's a really big topic to start to discuss. Israel and Gaza and those kinds of things. Let me put it this way. I'm not a great believer in the use of sanctions, and very often they tend to be counterproductive. The only successful case that I know is that of the South Africa of apartheid. I mean, then sanctions actually, they had a real influence on the developments there. And the situation with regard to Israel and Palestinians is somewhat similar, at least it's analogical. So in this case, a kind of a well-targeted and designed sanctions might be in order, and they could be helpful.
Thank you.
But maybe we're out of.
It's okay.
If it's okay. Yeah, just a quick comment. Thanks for the presentation. I was just wondering if you address in your book. I mean, if we think of this possibility of, if we imagine this possibility of a world parliament or some kind of a representative body, yeah. Mm-hmm. So if I understood you correctly, your idea is there that they would actually be enforcing in a way, actually legislating, be binding in a way that current treaties.
No, they would determine. The parliament would, at least at the outset, would simply determine what the law is. It would not legislate directly.
Okay. But then I'm wondering, like, because you also brought up this question of democracy, yeah. So I'm just wondering if it was the case that we had some kind of a world parliament or representative body, would like the usual democratic problems actually follow in a way? I mean, one would be, of course, this democratic deficit, which we have on various levels. Okay, so we have representative bodies, we have the European Parliament, we have here also a government which we can elect, and we don't partake really in governing. Okay, so that would be one. But then also, I mean, which is actually maybe a bigger risk, which is that there's no guarantee, right, that a world parliament is sort of invaded by good forces in a way, because it could just as well be hijacked by some sort of, Elon Musk or I don't know, something. Yeah, so I'm just wondering whether you, I don't expect you to answer this, but do you address in your book such risks that would,
in a sustainable, well-political community, there can't be billionaires. I mean, it has to be so egalitarian that no person like Elon Musk can simply assume power because he has so much money.
Yeah, but he's now. It doesn't seem to be very problematic for him to do such.
Yeah, I understand. So but to answer your question, the thing is that all democratic systems are vulnerable to all kinds of problems. It doesn't mean that democracy is not the best way of organizing power relations. And the second thing is that even though the World Parliament would have to be representative and elected body, but in the case of these functional organizations, I mean tax organizations for instance, there can be also a participatory part as well. Civil society organizations selected by means of lottery. So you simply put your lottery ticket in and see whether you are part of it. And so there's an participatory component as well. And you can actually combine different ideas about democracy. When we are talking about global democracy, it's not only one thing. I mean, we have participatory, we have representative democracy. Representation can also be indirect. So in many bodies, it can be like national parliamentarians that are represented in international or global organizations. But very often people also think global democracy in terms of interstate democracy. So, for instance, the United Nations General Assembly is based on the idea of one state, one vote. And independently of how powerful or how big in terms of population they are. So there are different ways of thinking about what international global democracy means. And very often we need to combine different principles in order to make it sustainable and legitimate.
Yeah, so that's something you address in the book. I mean, those.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get the book then. Where can we buy it?
It is actually most easily accessible through many libraries in the world. So there are 7,000 libraries in the world that give open access to this book.
Okay, nice. Thank you. Okay, so that is the end of our event today. I hope you enjoyed. That won't be the last. Let me go back to the other one. But you can find, so there were, POLIFA is found through polifa.org, and yours was, what was it called?
Globalvisions.fi.
Globalvisions.fi. So if you want to know more of the organizations, and I'm sure Heikki Patomäki is also found just by Googling. So I hope to see you soon in our next event. And thank you.